Hello, BookTube. Today is part 15 of my science fiction and fantasy library tour. Yeah, today's part 15. Sorry about that. This video wraps up the bookcase right here that was built by my grandfather about 30 some odd years ago. It's a short 3-shelf bookcase, and I quite enjoyed it. But anyway, so let's get on with the book. So we begin where we left off yesterday with some Clark Ashton Smith. This is The Return of the Sorcerer. This is the first book of Clark Ashton by Clark Ashton Smith that I read. I want to say I first became acquainted with Clark Ashton Smith on the Blackgate website. I think one of the bloggers wrote an article that featured Clark Ashton Smith, and I was intrigued and looked into it. Found a copy of this book at my local library, but when I requested it, it was nowhere to be found. Apparently, somebody checked it out or walked off with it, and it disappeared. So I had to interlibrary loan it. So I did. I read it. Really enjoyed it. Interlibrary loaned it again a few years later. Again, really enjoyed it. And The Return of the Sorcerer has been one of those books that I've wanted to add to my personal collection for quite some time, particularly by Clark Ashton Smith. So eventually I bought this book earlier this year, and I bought it through a Libris from Pals. So anyway, quite happy to have this finally in my personal collection. Some great stories in here. Let me see here. Really like Return of the Sorcerer. It's really great. The City of Singing Flame is great. Isle of the Torturers. The Dark Eidolon, The Seven Geeses, The Holiness of Azadorak, The Beasts of Everroin, The Empire of the Necromancers are all really great. So, just very happy to have this in my collection. So, next, let's move on to the last Clark Ashton Smith collection I have in my collection. This is the Dark Eidolon and Other Fantasies in the Penguin Classics edition, which, for as small as this is, I'm surprised it is like 370 pages. But anyway, so this has a pretty good collection of short stories and some poetry. Clark Ashton Smith was also a poet, and quite happy to have this collection in my collection. Looking forward to really giving this a deep dive. I mean, of course, there are some carryovers from this book to The Return of the Sorcerer to Lost Worlds, but what can you say? So this is probably the most easily available and cheapest. I know there's like a collected fantasies of Clark Ashton Smith that have been published over the past few years that are rather hard. I think they're somewhat hard to find. And there are also earlier collections that I really want. There's a Zothique collection I want, a Hyperborea collection I want, a Poseidonus collection I want. But, I mean, they're all old and rather expensive to pick up. So, probably off my budget. Books are also, or I think I mentioned this earlier or last time, that the Clark Ashton Smith's works are also online on, I think it's the Dark Eidolon, no, the Eldritch Dark website, I think. But it's been a while since I've checked that out. I'm not a huge fan of ebooks or reading stuff online. I can do it, but I don't necessarily really do it for pleasure. I much prefer physical copies of books. So, moving on from Clark Ashton Smith, I have 2 books by Nancy Springer. The White Heart, which is the first book in this series. I don't quite know what the series is, though. Doesn't say. Anyway, so lovely cover. I want to say I've read this. I think my local library has a collected edition of this series, or had. I mean, they might have withdrawn it by now. But I picked this up from the Friends of the Library Bookshelf Alcove. Before I picked that book up, I picked up The Golden Swan by Nancy Springer. This is, I think, the concluding volume, and I want to say I picked this one up from Bryce's Books. Or it might have been Golden's, but I want to say it was Bryce's. Maybe I picked up The White Heart from Golden's. I don't remember, one of the two. But I love this cover for very obvious reasons. But this is a Rowena cover, which I'm rather fond of her work. When I was younger, I was a part of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Book Club. Or I think it's a science fiction book club. And they'd offer sometimes certain famous cover artists would have like collections of their cover art available. And I think I picked up one by Rowena, and I think one by Boris Vallejo. But anyway, but hopefully eventually I will get to this book. So next I have a few books by John Sprunk. First is A Shadow's Son. This is the first book in, I'm not entirely sure what this series is. It'll probably be on the sequel. Anyway, so it's a former library book. It is from Gwinnett County Public Library. And it's in rather beat up condition, but I read this earlier this year and I rather liked it. Although I think the main antagonist was far more interesting than the main protagonist. So I also picked up from Alibris. I pretty much finished off the series. This is A Shadow's Lure. From Glen Elwyn Public Library, which I've been meaning to read because I have a bookmark in here. Probably will reread the entire series at some point this year or next year. And finally, I have Shadow's Master by John Sprunk, obviously. This is from the Bucks County Libraries. And I picked all of these up from Alibris, probably through Better World Books. But like I said, I probably will try to make a point of reading the entire series at some point next year. And next I have another series by John Sprunk. I've got 3 volumes in this one. I'm thinking there's a 4th volume supposed to be coming out or has already come out, which rather annoys me. So this is Blood and Iron, The Book of the Black Earth, Part 1. Love that cover. This series is more about, I think, inspired by Babylonian history and culture. Whereas the Shadow's Son series was more standard medieval. So this is book 2 in the Book of the Black Earth series. Storm and Steel. This is from the Lexington Public Library System. Picked it up used from Alibris. And this is the 3rd volume, Blade and Bone. So we'll probably make a point to read that series too at some point, either next year or the year after. And now I have 3 books by Neil Stephenson. This is Snow Crash, one of the seminal works of cyberpunk. And again, this is one of those books that have been niggling at me for years. And I'm quite happy I finally have it. Not entirely happy with the edition I have. It's a little bit beaten up, but it'll do. Picked it up through a Libris. I'm not entirely sure exactly which subseller or seller I got it from. I also have The Diamond Age, which I want to say I picked up from either Golden's Book Exchange or the Friends at the Library book sale. One of the two. And finally, I have the Cryptonomicon, which I want to say came from the Goldens, but it might have come from the Friends at the Library. No, it came from the mini book sale, I think, actually. Now that I think about it. And I have a random S.M. Stirling novel, A Meeting at Corvallis, which is one of his, this is, I want to say it's part 2, or maybe it's part 3 of his long-running series. I don't quite remember what the name of the series is, but I think this is like part 1, book 1, or book 2. I was hoping this was book 1, but it's actually book 2, so I need to make a point to collect these at some point. So wrapping them up, we get to a lot of anthologies. This is Swords and Dark Magic, The New Sword and Sorcery, edited by Jonathan Strahan and Lou Anders. Again, this is one of those books that have plagued me for a while. I want to say I either checked it out of the library or Interlibrary loaned it before I found a copy at Hastings, which was a bookstore, comic book shop, entertainment store, kind of all rolled into one, that had a pretty good collection of science fiction and fantasy. Also manga. And I think I picked this up, and then I purged all of my fantasy, or a good chunk of it, including Swords and Dark Magic, regretted it, and then eventually bought it through this copy, I want to say through a Libris, which quite happy I have this back in my collection. I really do enjoy this anthology. It has stories by Steven Erikson, Glenn Cook. The Steven Erikson story is fantastic. Gene Wolfe, James Ing, which I really need to collect some of his work. C.J. Sherry, A Wizard in Wysazen, is phenomenal. I absolutely love that story. K.J. Parker, Garth Nix, Michael Moorcock, Tim Levin, Robert Silverberg, Greg Keyes, Michael Shea, Scott Lynch, Kenneth Lee, which I think was fairly good, Caitlin R. Kiernan, Bill Willingham, and Joe Abercrombie. Next, I have another book edited by Jonathan Strahan, this time with Charles N. Brown. This is the Locus Awards. 30 years of the best in science fiction and fantasy. So, I don't think I ever had another edition of this book. Earlier, I think I checked it out from the library a few times and really wanted it in my collection, so I finally picked it up. This is a used library book from Meridian Public Library. Anyway, quite happy to have this in my collection. So this has books by Gene Wolfe, Ursula K. Le Guin, Harlan Ellison, John Varley, Georgia R. Martin, Joanna Russ, Octavia Butler, James Tiptree, Pat Murphy, Lucius Shepard, Terry Bison, John Kessel, Connie Willis, John Crowley, Bruce Sterling, Greg Egan, Ted Chiang, and Neil Gaiman. And stopping off from the anthologies, we have... Oh no, that finished off the anthologies. I have a book in the Bartemius trilogy. This is book 2, The Golem's Eye, by Jonathan Stroud. I went to Golden's Book Exchange in August or October. I'm blanking now. I think it was August. And it was a horrific experience. It was an adventure. But while I was waiting for the bus to bring me back, I looked at the free card. So Golden's has a little shopping cart outside the store filled with books that they're offering for free. And this was one of them. And so I picked it up. Pretty beat up copy. Next I have Tasha Suri's Empire of Sand, which I read late last year. And I thought it was good. I probably need to give this another reread. It was good, not necessarily anything spectacular. I do kind of want to pick up the sequel when I get the chance, but I definitely want to give this another go. And next I have 2 novels by Sam Sykes. This is the Tome of the Undergates, the Eon's Gate book 1, or the first book in the Eon's Gate series. Picked this up from Hastings. I want to say when Hastings was going out of business about 3 years ago, they were having massive sales, and I went and picked up quite a few, and this was one of them. So later I picked up Black Halo, which is a sequel to Eon's Gate, or the second book in the Eon's Gate trilogy. And this is from Alibris. I'm not a former library book, even though it is beaten up like it's one. So anyway, so tomorrow we will start, or not tomorrow, Monday, we will begin with the final 2 shelves I have left, which will begin with some Sam Sykes. So until then, thank you, BookTube. Have a great day.